Greetings all, this is Ohio Dan, back to recording videos for the first time in quite a while actually. There's a topic that I have pretty much never seen discussed within the men's community or really online at all that I can remember at least, and I'm sure somebody else has probably discussed something very similar to this, but that is the kind of double-edged sword of a traditional upbringing. The kind of paradoxical results of being raised with traditional or semi-traditional values in a Western country today, and how there is an element of stability if your parents manage to stay together and if your family doesn't tear itself apart while you're growing up. There's a strong measure of stability in your life that is applied through that process, but there is kind of a price to pay later on in adulthood if you don't adjust to the world for what it really is. So one thing I've accepted recently concerning all this is that while having a traditional upbringing appears to provide a stable basis for a potentially successful life, and there's obviously a lot of variables that can derail you along the way, but nonetheless, it appears that this is a stable basis for preparing you for success in life, but it can actually sabotage a lot of people in the long run because there's a core problem with being raised in a traditional way, and that is that Western civilization is no longer traditional at all in the way that it generally operates. And it often punishes people for pursuing a traditional type of lifestyle instead of reinforcing traditional values. In other words, when you pursue traditional goals, when you have a traditional worldview and you just think that you're going to get married and have kids and find a good job and work hard and have a house that's worthy of raising a family in, that is comfortable and all that, and then you look at how the world actually is, where you're rewarded for being a victim. You are destroyed the moment that a woman decides that she's not happy in a marriage and wants to take half your stuff and to weaponize your kids against you. You, by working hard and not working smart necessarily, which, of course, I'm not saying that even traditionalists don't think you should work smart, but if you just think that working hard is a way of working smart, or you believe that you can combine those ideas, and as long as you give your best effort, that things are just going to work out, you are just going to get used up in this society. That application of a traditional lifestyle will get you in trouble quite a bit these days because it just frankly does not work. It's not a viable life path, and honestly, the powers that be, those that have largely manipulated the direction that the United States and other Western countries have gone, they know that they can take advantage of these traditional people, especially traditional men, take their labor, take their productivity, and then just toss them to the wolves, basically, when they are no longer able to be as productive, or you're just better off taking advantage of that man by having the family dissolve, or by essentially just blaming him for something so that he can be a scapegoat, or whatever the case may be, an accusation at work made against you, even though you've been a hard worker and you've given that job your best. As soon as somebody that's in one of the so-called victim groups makes an accusation against you, even if it's pretty much totally false, you get screwed over anyway. And so, as a result of these factors being in play, having a traditional mindset will often cause you to focus on making the wrong choices when it comes to relationships, family, the workplace, and essentially any major life circumstance where having an accurate understanding of the world is necessary. In other words, you come into the game incredibly naive if you actually grew up in a stable, traditional type of family structure. You aren't going to realize what you're up against if you're not taught the truth, which is that, for the most part, being traditional doesn't work anymore. It's important to have values. It's important to know where you stand on things and to be aware of who you are, so to speak. But just being a traditional man or woman, really, if you actually try to be a traditional woman and do things the right way, you're going to be shamed for that too. You're going to have extra obstacles and barriers in your way as well. I would argue that as a woman, that's still more of a viable option in terms of having a family. But even then, because of the nature of our economy, you probably are going to have to work. You're really not going to be able to be traditional, because even as a woman trying to do things the right way, you're going to still find yourself in a lot of trouble with dealing with a lot of difficulties, because it's just not really viable. It has been made untenable as a life strategy for basically everybody involved, because society has turned its back on traditional Western values, on the way that essentially led to the United States in particular probably reaching its peak in the 1980s and 90s. I'm not saying that we haven't improved on certain things since that point, but to a large extent, we are just now leveraging people that are foolish enough to have this traditional mindset as cogs in the wheel, so that those that really are benefiting from people's labor, who are benefiting from the status quo when it comes to families, the status quo when it comes to how community is defined, if that makes sense. In other words, we want to do things that benefit single moms. We want to do things that benefit other so-called victim groups. You can look at gender, race, sexual orientation, and whatever else. It's really not about unifying people toward a good common end. It's just a matter of how can we get these people that are still believing in this traditional worldview, how can we get those people to expend all their time and effort in a way that benefits us, in a way that allows us to maximize taxation? That's another issue, is that people are being taxed out the wazoo in a lot of cases, and they can't get ahead because every other cost in life has gone up, but they're not really making any more money. They're just being taxed to death. And then people that essentially vote a certain way, or at the very least they support the status quo. They support corporations and the government kind of controlling them. They don't want necessarily to have strong families. They don't want to do things in a traditional manner. They want the new way, which is dependency on the ruling class, dependency on those that really already control most of the wealth in the country. And so the situation has been gamed, and having a traditional way of going about things is really not a viable path in most cases, in my opinion. So the point of what I'm saying here is that although your childhood may appear to have been stable and nurturing, if you grew up with traditional values in a generally intact traditional home, yes, you had a leg up with that compared to being raised by a single mom. You had a lot of advantages compared to having people believe that you're not a very good person just because of who you are and what group you happen to fit into necessarily. If you had people that taught you that you should work hard, that you should apply yourself, that Western values and ideas are effective in a positive way, there's an advantage of that by leaps and bounds over growing up in an unstable home. But sometimes it isn't until later when the incongruence between a traditional worldview and lived experience in a world that's not traditional, a non-traditional society, it's only later on that this manifests itself, so that the maladaptive nature of a traditional upbringing is brought to bear. It's only later on, as you become a young adult, that you realize, oh, this isn't going to work. Traditional marriage, that doesn't really exist anymore. I know people won't like hearing that, but one disagreement that I have with the religious aspect of this is that biblical marriage really doesn't exist. It's a contract with the state where one person can screw over the other person anytime they want because they're not happy, and most of the time it's a woman doing this to a man. So how is that traditional or biblical? Religion plays a big part in this as well. Obviously, if religion was something that existed in your home, that gets warped into traditionalism in many cases. It's all sort of part of the same type of belief system, at least sometimes, but it doesn't change the fact that society is no longer traditional. Society doesn't care about these values. Society just wants to take advantage of you for thinking this way, for having this type of worldview. So I believe that if you come from a traditional background and then struggled with certain life events early on in adulthood, it's an understandable and even expected result given how anti-traditional our society has largely become lately. If you grew up believing in the American dream and how your life needed to center around, especially economically, trying to get ahead in that way, and then you look at how the housing market is, you look at how expensive things like groceries have become, you look at how healthcare is just unaffordable unless you're either on the dole or you have insurance through your employer, but ultimately your job can be taken away from you at any time. And then if you have a health crisis, all the money that you've been saving can go in a flash if you were able to save a whole lot to begin with. You see how the middle class has been decimated by certain events and efforts over the past few decades, especially the past 10 or 15 years. You can look at essentially this effort to use traditional people and their labor and their efforts to work for a system that pretty much hates them, to work for people that have no desire whatsoever to reward people for their efforts. Traditionalism is pretty much dead, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it. But in Western society, being traditional really is no longer a viable strategy. In my experience, it takes a while for someone who had a traditional type upbringing but has kind of come to a realization of the issues that I'm talking about here, has come to potentially realize that traditionalism is not going to work. It takes a while to realign your lived experiences with the values you may embrace moving forward, likely evolving beyond traditionalism into a more pragmatic way of looking at your place in the world and what should really be important. Like I've suggested with some of my other videos, making every connection that you have based on reciprocity, based on mutual benefit. If somebody is not a team player in your life, you don't need to try to be a provider and protector for everyone. If somebody is not treating you fairly at work, or you're not getting ahead at work anyway, maybe you're better off not giving 100% at that job. Or you selectively do what you have to do, but you don't go out of your way to help other people. That's not really a traditional way of doing things. It's not a way of making yourself a leader in that sense, or pursuing sort of the provider-protector role from a guy's point of view, but so what? That doesn't work anyway. And so you learn to abandon and shed those sort of things that may have been part of the type of stuff you did in the past. And I'm sure it's obvious that to some extent here I'm talking about myself. I'm talking about my own awakening, because this pretty much is what I experienced. And I think that other men are most likely experiencing this type of shift between when you were younger and believed in all this nonsense about getting married and having kids and being able to afford a home and just working hard at the same job for 30 or 40 years and just applying yourself in a way that the boomers, and I'm not trying to pick on one generation or the other here. You could talk about any other generation you want, right? Some of the silent gen people or older Gen X people that taught you about a traditional path in life, that might have worked great when they were young, but it's not really a viable option today. And I just want to let anybody else who has experienced this, where growing up it seemed like they had a pretty good situation, and in some ways you did, but the traditional aspect of it all really misled you when it came to understanding what can actually work out in the real world. Because being traditional is just going to get you used up. It's just going to get you exploited. It's a path to failure when you apply it to the decisions that you make for your own life in real time. based on what options are actually available to you. The traditional path has been exploited to such a degree, in my opinion, that it's really not worthwhile anymore, even if you wanted that. Even if you decided that's what you wanted to do, it's just why? You're not getting anything out of it. There's no place for you. It's all going to boil down to you being on the right side of history or not, or your race or gender or sexual orientation and what you agree with and don't agree with. And then when bad things happen, you can't afford anything. That's the other side of this, is even outside of the ideological aspect of it, you can't afford most things anyway, because the powers that be have decided that they're just going to tax you to death and then leave you with a pittance, right? They're going to leave you with just enough to survive. And so the idea of working hard and having a family and having a home and having a nice vehicle that you saved up money to buy, all that's pretty much bullshit today, in my opinion. And so the sooner that you abandon the idea that a traditional mindset is going to work in modern times, the better. That doesn't mean that you don't have a moral compass. That doesn't mean that you don't know right from wrong, or that you just go ahead and join the victim Olympics, that you try to outdo what everybody else is doing. That's not what I'm saying. But you focus on yourself and the people and the things that deserve to matter. And this idea that you have to be this kind of man or woman for society's benefit can just be tossed aside, because it's all about exploiting you at this point. It's about taking advantage of people that have a traditional worldview and belief system and using those people to allow a lot of the corruption and a lot of the just generally evil things that people do today to profit. It's all about making money and benefiting those that already have control over most things in the United States and other Western countries. So being traditional really isn't a winning strategy. I want to know if you guys have been through the same kind of experience, if you were raised with a traditional type of upbringing, because I think today it's better to shift away from that. And it's understandable how, as you became accustomed to how the world really works, you really had to change your mindset, because if you had a traditional upbringing, you probably had to abandon a lot of the things that don't work today in a society that is no longer traditional really at all in terms of how things operate.